Singer?
Yeah.
Some boys hug me, some boys kiss me, I think they're okay, yay. If they give me proper credit, I don't turn away, yay. Because I'm a material girl. How does it go? All right, screwed it up. My wife even told me, don't sing in class. Yeah. However, I love the part where you get to the, I'm a material girl. That's just kind of cool. So a Nietzschean feels that really, as a nihilist, his narrative is to destroy stuff. So if people are happy, do his best to actually screw them up. So there's that part of it too. There's tons of ways of looking at it.
So if that's the case, then what does a nihilist exactly do to exist? What is it that they exactly have or feel that keeps them going in some way? I remember I read this book once called Grendel, and there was like a dragon or whatever that had like a bunch of gold, but thought a way that nothing really mattered. But I never really understood why he kept it if he really felt that way, or tried to kill anybody, or tried to take his gold, and he felt like nothing mattered, including the gold itself.
Something to pass the time.
Something to pass the time.
Could be.
Well, we can't die and life has no meaning, might as well do something.
Oh, there's a neat poem that I'm not sure the original of the poem. It could be Cicero. It's, I think, in Dante's Inferno. And it's in Eliot. Eliot quotes it in T.S. Eliot. Wasteland. Maybe this. So this very first introduction, which is Nam Sibylam, quidem cumis ego ipse oculus meis vidi, in ampula pendere, e cum illi pueri dicerent Sibylla, ti thelis respondebat illa apothenean thelo. So what is this all about? In the Latin, it's saying, we saw Sibyl from Cumis with our own eyes hanging in a glass ampule, right? And you have to know, Sibyl has been promised eternal life. That was what she wanted as her reward. And so the God granted her eternal life, but he didn't stop her from aging. And so she's eternal, but she keeps getting older and older and older, so she's a shriveled up little life form just sitting in this glass container. And so the boys see her and they ask, "What do you want?" And she responds, "I want to die." That's her response. Because if you're living a life where you're not actually doing anything, your satisfaction in life comes from believing that you want to be a good father, a good husband, a good citizen, and accomplishing those things, and feeling the reward of having achieved your goal, and if you have no goals, why would you get up in the morning? Why would you expend any energy to do anything, if you think about it? And I think that's what happens to an awful lot of people. So if we think about suicide as a growing problem in our country and Europe, it's where does that problem happen? Now, a lot of people feel suicidal because life is absolutely sucky, miserable for them, because of things out of their control, and I understand why some people, are that way. But for a lot of people, the reason they end up feeling suicidal is because they've gotten to the point where the narrative that they believed growing up is no longer believable, and now they have anime. They're no identity, right? And so they literally don't believe they have a point or a reason for living. And the existentialist in this way maybe can be freeing. I feel like it's actually kind of scary, and Kierkegaard especially, doesn't recover from this damage to him. He says, well, you go through these life stages, and at this stage, I realize that the stage of faith is the only stage that really works. But then he's never able to convince himself to believe the faith that he thinks is the one he ought to pick. And so he dies, right? Well, I think, for people that are healthy, have all sorts of resources, have a good education, compare the two people in the foxhole. Famously, the one in the foxhole that believes they're there to defend democracy and freedom, and the enemy, the Nazis, coming are, you've got to fight them, even though they're going to kill you now. It's the Blitz, on the Battle of the Bulge or something, right? And so the ones that are in the foxholes, only 100 or 2, literally fight off a whole battalion of German tanks, and they finally get captured, and the Germans can't believe there were just these few people fighting them all this time. It actually held them up so that they ended up losing, right? But there were also individuals in those foxholes that didn't believe that narrative, and they were scared to death, and they ran for it, right? So you can see the difference in the way the belief in what your point of living is in just that serious of a situation, right? Imagine, when you're thinking, gee, there's no future, there's fewer jobs, the, world meteorological situation is horrible, we're just going to have one disaster after another. Part of the problem is there's 8 billion people now, and that's way too many for the earth to support. The best thing I can do is leave. They're believing in a narrative that says that's what they should do. And it's a terrible narrative. Why be persuaded to believe that kind of narrative, right? Anybody see the movie Donnie Darko?
I just watched it like 2 days ago.
I was wondering why am I thinking about Donnie Darko? Thanks. Perfect example of a young man that feels like in order to protect all of his friends, he ought to die. Yeah. I thought, wow, what a dark theme to have that. But you see, the point is, for this kind of a problem, it's a result of your education, and apparently an education that leaves you with a feeling like none of these stories are true. Well, that's false, isn't it?
So what's the major difference between the idea of like everything terrible happening all at once, and you're looking at it through Twitter, and saying the world's going to end in like 6 months, as opposed to having an objective fact like the sun's going to explode in 2.5 billion years.
Well, don't pet the feathers. Okay, nobody got that. That's Don't Look Up. There's a movie, Don't Look Up.
Oh.
Okay. Well, the thing is, science can be wrong. The meteorite's coming, we're going to die. Oops, it missed. So everything keeps going. One of my friends finally moved after having 2 or 3 years of fires near her she lived near Yosemite, and she finally had it, that the fires and the smoke was so bad, so she sold her house to some person and moved to the beach. Well, this last couple of storms that they've had, she was evacuated from her house and she was cut off, the road washed away, and Meanwhile, we're spoiled to death living here, where it's Alaska, so it's cold, it's snowing, but you know what? A lot of people pay lots of money to come here for that. They're called tourists. So you really don't know what the future is. There was a neat book by Neil Stephenson or Stevenson, if you're familiar with him, called Seven Daughters of Eve, or Seven Eves, rather. Seven Eves. And the beginning of that is that the moon falls apart. And as it does, it ends up collapsing onto the earth and destroying life on earth. But thousands of years later, humans are still around and have developed a whole new society, etc. Interesting book. So who knows? So let's get back to, where were we here? Sorry if I get distracted. I love all these topics, though. Thank you for asking them. But I want to quick go through the pre-Socratics so that we're ready to talk about Socrates next class. So when we think about the pre-Socratics, that's pretty easy. It's before Socrates. That's not hard, right? And we're looking at not really that far back. And we're talking about maybe 100 years, 200 years in some of them. Thales of Miletus is considered to be the first philosopher. And the reason, and by the way, at least this link works. The only one of these that didn't last night when I checked was the one on Heraclitus. And these links are fairly old, but are texts. And the texts that you can find on the internet that are attributed to them are usually quoted by Aristotle or Plato or someone who wrote later. So even though they might have written texts, in fact, I think Anaxagoras did write texts, they're lost. So as far as we know, we don't have actual texts from them, right? But we do have quotations in other later philosophers who attribute these quotations to them. Whether that's accurate or not, who knows? But Thales is considered one of the 7 sages of Greece. Very interesting that, if you check Wikipedia, they've got terrific Wikipedia articles on all of these guys. And there are women too, by the way, although in the tradition that I was brought up with, the women were kind of like, yeah, it's kind of interesting. Socrates had a woman that taught him all this stuff. Who was she? I don't know. But Thales is the first one who's thought of as a philosopher because he comes up with an explanation for why there is stuff that isn't dependent on a deity creating everything. Doesn't mean that he didn't believe the deity created everything, but he thought that the substance, the arche, the building block of all of creation was water. So that's kind of interesting. Anaximenes, who was a friend of his and learned, and a little bit older, or a little bit younger rather, and came up with the concept of air, because water is thicker than air. And so you end up with, by the way, it's kind of interesting, Aristotle did not think fish breathed because they couldn't breathe air. He didn't realize that there's actually air mixed in water, because of course we know that there's a mixture of these elements. He thought there was just these 4 elements, actually 5 for Aristotle. But so Anaximander was weird. He thought it was the infinite because you couldn't have air unless there was the infinite in which air kind of took place. The infinite and the void. 2 necessities, logically, for there to be anything. We thought. Heraclitus gives us fire, and that might have been more of a metaphor for change. That you can't step into the same river twice, because it's not really the same river anymore. You're not really the same person you were when you walked in here, even from moment to moment. That's one way of thinking about it. And one of the our contemporaries, if you're interested, is Being No One, Thomas Metzinger. So this is, someone who's completely jumped into the idea that we're, Heraclitean in a sense that we're constantly changing, so that you're not really a fixed objective self. You're constantly in a process, right? Oh, I don't know what's going on there. But, so that's Thomas Metzinger. He's, by the way, most of the ones that I mentioned are in my list of philosophers that you could do your term paper on. So, change. And by the way, Hera, you've heard of Hera, the wife of Zeus, who's the goddess of order and matrimony and time, and where we get the word hour from. So an hour. And so Heraclitus means the glory of Hera. So it's kind of interesting that Heraclitus' name means kind of his philosophy. Kind of interesting. And Anax, I looked up, means chief or tribal chief. And so all these names literally mean different things. But he says atoms, and atom is Greek for uncuttable. You can't cut it. And so when they discovered that they could cut atoms, we probably should have changed the name of that. Instead, they kept it as atom, and then discovered we have the different particles, subatomic particles, and quarks, and so on. And mine is nous, so there's kind of an ordering to the universe. It's quite interesting, really. A lot of these seem very similar to the new variations that come up as you go through time. This is kind of like, these are all repetitious stories that get refined and developed a little bit further and further. Pythagoras, you've probably heard about because of the theorem that he stole from the Egyptians. And pith means speaking out, and agora means the marketplace. So speaking out in the marketplace, which is odd because he's famous for having a secret society. So that's weird. And Plato is considered a Pythagorean. So that's interesting too. Parmenides is fascinating, and a lot of these folks are actually arguing with Parmenides, because Parmenides says it's all the infinite, and it's one, and it's solid, so you can't have any change. Change is an illusion. And so all the others that are inventing these concepts are, in a way, arguing with him, because they're trying to explain how you can have change and stability at the same time. How does that work, right? So Parmenides, the dialogue of Parmenides, that's Plato's, I think of para meaning two, mena meaning unchanging, and ideas. So the problem with the Parmenides is this question of infinity and it's unchanging. So how can you believe on the one hand that there's no change, and yet at the same time that obviously change happens? So how do you do that? Right? Zeno is a follower of Parmenides, and he's the one that gives us the famous Zeno paradoxes. Paradoxa means you have to believe both of these things. Paradoxa, right? And he gives you, for example, Achilles fires an arrow, and the arrow goes from point A to point B. Before it gets to point B, it has to go half the distance. Before it goes half that distance, it has to go half that distance, and half that distance, and half that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it goes half and half and half and half and half an infinite amount of time,